Hello and welcome to another episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, Alan Wyma, and today I'm with Leo Farias. I hope I said that okay. I know we kind of practiced a little bit before the show. Before I turn it over to you, I want to give one last shout out. So as you guys may know, we are actually running a course right now with how to integrate Rust and Flutter together. So if you're interested to check out the course, it's rustwithflutter.com. Again, rustwithflutter.com if you're interested to see how you can integrate your Rust code with your Flutter projects. Now back to the show. Leo, sorry to kind of cut you off before you can talk about yourself. Now it's your turn, and I did my own little self-plug. Why don't you go ahead and just kind of introduce yourself to the world, although people should already know who you are.
Alan, thank you very much for having me on. Be watching the podcast for a while, and you have some great people, and I'm honored to be here. I'm Leo Farias, as you mentioned. I've been working with Flutter for I think end of 2018 or so, a little bit after they announced it. I have created some tools and some utilities, most famously FVM, which has been used. Day to day, I'm CEO of Concepta, which is a development agency located in the United States, in Florida. And, we focus a lot of enterprise development, mobile development. And that's pretty much where I am.
How do you find the business of actually working in Flutter in consultancy? Do you find it good or bad? Because it's like, I feel like there's a big business in this because I'm kind of doing the same thing, and there's very good ventures. And I think there's one or two others that kind of goes off the top of my head. Like, do you think there's actually enough pie for everybody to kind of eat on? Because, I mean, there's Flutter's still quite new, right? In terms of, and also the market share is quite small.
Yeah. So we're not a consultancy that specializes only on Flutter development. A lot of that we do is, overall web development, enterprise APIs, and we work a lot with React Native, especially shared code between web and so on. And we are very interested in Flutter because we feel like there's a huge overlap, especially once the web piece comes together. It is, I think, in enterprise, not all enterprises, but I think when you're talking about medium-sized enterprises and large-sized enterprises, not let's say the Fortune 100 companies, they are lagging a little bit behind. But we start seeing people that they understand that going fully native iOS, native Android has some overhead, and they have some concerns about some of the other solutions like React Native from performance reasons and so on. So Flutter gives an opportunity to say it fits well. It's a little bit of the best of both worlds. But the way I see where Flutter is going, I mean, there's definitely it's going to be enough of the pie for everyone. The demand is just too great, especially when talking about technology and the problems people are trying to solve. I think on the medium-sized enterprise, I do think it lags a little bit behind. And then comes, for agencies and consultancies to come in and say, okay, here's the pros and cons, because every technology has their pros and cons, to educate the client and, be able to push them in the right direction.
But you still do React Native consultancy?
Yes.
So what's your opinion about... Sorry, go ahead.
React Native, we do a lot of React Native, especially because, again, it's a lot of the web and web making transition. So there's a lot of, let's say, shared domain when you're trying to implement, let's say, Node and front-end in React and React Native. It gives a good, let's say, shared domain, shared knowledge, right? Shared packages, shared libraries. One of the reasons I'm interested in Dart and Flutter is because they are solving, I feel like they're going towards the same direction, but they have created a technology from the ground up that I think eventually will solve these problems much better. Once you add the web, I think when it comes to mobile, Flutter, the development experience and overall development results, I think is overall much better.
Why do you think that Flutter will make a headway? Because if you think about it, when you're in web, basically React is kind of the framework. I think Vue is kind of also up there too. But if you have a choice between React and Vue, if you think about getting into getting into mobile app development, obviously React Native would be a very close call, like you kind of said. So why do you think that Flutter would have some kind of challenge to this? I mean, it's still kind of lacking SEO support, a lot of things, right? It's basically a new language, although it's similar to JavaScript. Why would you think something like this?
So I think the biggest thing going against, there's a lot of articles about performance and memory consumption and things like that in React Native and against Flutter, which I think those are valid articles. If you're in a mature situation where we're trying to optimize, right, and a second, app startup is critical for your business, which there's a lot of business that they are and things like that. Those things are extremely important. But for a lot of companies that they just want to be able to iterate quickly and go to market, the decision is they're willing to give away a little bit for performance. Now, the biggest downside that I see with, I'll say JavaScript tooling, and to be honest, I'll say TypeScript, because we use TypeScript in the company. I couldn't imagine developing an app not using TypeScript. But when it comes to TypeScript / JavaScript tooling, it's not there yet. It's very painful overall when you compare it to something like Flutter, right? So the debug experience from React Native is extremely poor compared to Flutter. The overall tooling, the build process is actually, and there's some projects, right? There's some projects, interesting projects, I think, Rome tools that aim on creating a ground up solution for JavaScript. We've seen things like Dino, right? The alternative to Node that wants also from ground up to be a better tool for JavaScript. But the overall experience of building a React Native app and the overall maintenance of native dependencies and so on, it is I'll say it's much worse experience from a developer side of maintaining. Now, if you install a fresh React Native app and you start building it, it can, be an overall good experience. But once you're there, you start bringing a lot of dependencies and you have to update it. Right, these native sites, the tooling is just not there. So I think that's one of the biggest downside outside of performance. Performance is extremely important, but there's some interesting things happening in React Native that I think they'll be good enough, but the dev side is still lacking.
Yeah, I think they have some new thing called Flux or something that they're kind of starting to push. Have you heard of this before?
No, not Flux. I've been following a lot of the JSI, right? The JavaScript bridge that didn't improve performance. They have some things for, they have the debugging tool. I believe it's called Flipper, but it is not there, right? The fact that overall, the fact that you don't have, and that's what I tell people, what is the difference between Flutter and React Native? And what I tell them is this: for most part, on Flutter and Darts, if your IDE is not giving errors, your app will compile. And when it comes to JavaScript tooling, especially React Native, it is a little bit of a Russian roulette. You're not guaranteed to compile, right? If the dependency is resolved, your IDE indicates that things are fine on Flutter, your app will compile. And in React Native is like, why is this happening, right? Error, some configuration change, and so on. So, if companies are behind it, I'm sure they will make it work and be good enough. But Flutter, it's from the ground up approach. And I think overall solve the problem much better I see the problem that Flutter is trying to solve, the unified UI problem, right? The only technology that we have for unified UI right now, it's web, right? Projects like Electron, right? React Native, and so on. You had Cordova, Ionic. That's unified UI. And Flutter, it is being built from the ground up to be a better solution for unified UI.
Yeah, this is true though too. But the other thing is that it's not, I don't know how to explain, but I mean, it does kind of abstract some things, right? Like with HTML, it's pretty quite clear how things work. But with Flutter, I mean, how it makes these different components. I mean, there's different types of renderers, right? You have to understand there's like I know there's Canvas, which is kind of like the default one, but then there's the other one. I can't remember what that one's called for web. Like that part is a little bit more complicated as opposed to React. It's like, okay, this is just HTML, CSS, JavaScript, very straightforward. You know what I mean? Like that's the kind of thing.
So yeah, so for example, in React you have similar things, right? With React Native, you have whatever the Mac is equivalent, the iOS, right? The Android. Now, I don't say it's too much. I guess you could call a renderer, but it's not painting the elements, right? It's actually, let's say, calling the native elements on the screen. I think when it comes to the Flutter web, and I'm extremely interested, I don't think it's there yet for a lot of the use cases. And I know there's been some debates about, Flutter as an app application, or Flutter as, for websites and things like that. I think it's approaching a good solution for a lot of use cases. But long term, I think for Flutter to be successful as a unified UI, I think it's already successful on iOS and Android. But I think to be successful on the unified UI, it needs to be good enough for websites, and I think it needs to be good enough for you to use it as web components, right? So you have, let's say, a React app, but you have this Flutter piece, this Flutter web components. It needs to be good enough. It means it needs to be lightweight enough. It needs to be fast enough. Not the fastest, not the lightest, but it needs to be good enough for that use case. So it really opens up the shared UI abilities of Flutter.
Yeah, that's the one thing I don't know if you could do this, but I'm sure you should be able to do this, which is like to build some type of really interesting web component, like you called it, that separate piece you could just embed into a website. That's attractive to me because like I'm thinking about for this podcast to put like a Flutter like web player on there so you can play the episodes from the website. But my site's all using HTML and I don't want to switch it to Flutter Web because the SEO is just not there yet. And it's also very light, right? It's just text. And I don't have any other JavaScript down there. So that's why I feel like if I could just have this component, that would be pretty happy with it. But I don't know, can you actually do something like that? Because I haven't tried, but I don't think it's very straightforward though.
So there's an open issue that I'm following, and I can send it to you so you can add to the show notes so people can thumbs up. So hopefully you can get this going. So right now, the suggested implementation for this is through an iframe. Right? So essentially you're creating a Flutter application and you put it on an iframe. I think there's someone that was able to hack together to have let's say the Flutter application to render not at the root of the DOM and actually render, within a specific element. But it's not an official implementation, and it's a little bit of a hack around it. So, it'll be interesting to see. But the iframe is the initial implementation. But with iframe, you can embed anything anywhere, but you're lacking some of that performance and, the shared context and functions and states and stuff like that. Things become a little bit more difficult, right? But I mean, it is a solution for, I think, a small number of use cases. I think is a good alternative.
The other thing I don't really like is I think they kind of separate like, okay, Flutter for native and then Flutter for web. The reason I say that is because like even if you wanted to use like isolates, there's no isolate anymore within Dart for web. You actually have to use workers or something. I think they call it. That's kind of interesting. Yeah, there's definitely some mismatch between the two. And if you want to work with, like you said, the surrounding context, the JavaScript stuff, you have to pull in this JS library. It does feel like that separation for some strange reason. I'm not too sure why that is. I mean, obviously, okay, I'm sure why it is, but it'd be nice if there's more unified towards like, if you write Flutter apps and, you could be more just really like, okay, this is Flutter, this is Dart, rather than saying, okay, this is for web, so I have to do this. Even if you make a plugin, right, you also have to do it a little bit different just for web, which I think is a little bit annoying, but, there's probably reasons for that, I'm guessing, because of the way the web works, which is kind of a little bit sad.
Yeah, I think I think there's always reasons for it. Based on I'm willing to be corrected on this, but when going through the issues on the Flutter team, and I think they're doing an amazing job, they seem to prefer developers having control and, being very clear what they're doing, right? So not trying to hide too much magic behind. So I'm not following the, let's say, the workers isolates thing. For example, isolates and workers make sense being together if you talk about more of a separate thread. But maybe is the way web works is a different implementation where they want to be clear that, hey, this actually is different enough where you should think about it differently. And I do appreciate that, right? Sometimes it can be from a developer side, kind of go through the documentation, but I think they have great documentation, but I think it's a safe side to go, especially when there's I think we're just seeing just the beginning of Flutter when it comes to some of these use cases.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to actually talk a little bit more about like why you started getting into Flutter. Like when you started getting into Flutter, I think React Native's already out there, right? You're already probably using that for your clients. Would you actually have this web consulting company? Like what kind of happened that you decided to start looking at Flutter?
So we started using Flutter. There's a company I found that they're still going very well called FinHero. And that was an initial spin-off from the agency Concepta. And, we raised some money and we were in a hiring spree. And I was a CTO, co-founder CTO of the company. And I think when it came to version 2.0 of the app, we started thinking about, we need to go on the hybrid side. We're going to go, and start actually building it in React Native, the initial app, right? And that was probably, I think around somewhere 2018 or so. And there are some benefits at the time. I think React Native has evolved a lot since then. So for people that love React Native, all technologies have evolved. But because we are in a lot of our users were, in let's say developing countries, and we have a big presence in Latin America, in India, in South Africa, right? And it means that we had a lot of Android devices, and I'll say low performance Android devices a lot of the time. And this was something that was difficult with React Native, right? And especially we're talking about app with lists, lists is always a thing that you have to, I think if you're a Flutter developer, you kind of take it for granted. Like, oh, here's a list and it works. And that's not the case. So you have to, it's extremely painful. It was extremely painful to build some of these things in React Native and have perform well. And so we're making, evolving there and, kind of validating, if you will. We're not really, we're building, but still validating. And Flutter, we're following Flutter, but everything looks good from a sales pitch, right? So everything like, oh, it does this, and that. I'm like, oh, okay, sure you do. And we decided we're having some specific pain points. And we're like, let's go ahead and create a POC for Flutter, what a Flutter app would look like. So for FinHero, we start building the app using Flutter and, getting the tools and so on, everything set up. One of the big pain points right in the beginning that we saw is that we had this, I'll say technology in our app called App Bridge, right? Which essentially is, we did these white label apps and customers could deploy almost like these web applications within their native applications, right? So if there's a functionality that the app doesn't offer, they could deploy essentially a React app or something like that with it. And all the APIs calls used to happen on the native side. So any HTTP request happening on the React Native app, on the React app extension, if you will, would call the native HTTP access to all these APIs, right? And when we start implementing Flutter, we're saying, okay, here's the downside. We don't have web views. So when we first started validating Flutter, they didn't even have web views. And we're like, whoa, I'm sure they're going to get there. So let's continue to work a little bit in parallel with that. And I'll make a long story short. Eventually, when we finally got the initial, let's say, screen layout done, at least one screen and one layout done, It was like an introduction screen that we had in mind and looked extremely good on iOS. We're like, okay, here's the ultimate test. Now make it work on Android. So we just got the crappiest Android device we had, right? Small screen and everything. We built it for the device and it just looked perfect. And, we've never seen something like this because everywhere you can say it, but I think only web you'll be able to have this type of result. React Native has not been able to do it. All these other solutions, you'll not be able to do it, right? The Xamarin's of the world and so on. To look how it was meant on a completely separate device that never ran before, that has never happened before. So we're like, okay, this is definitely the right technology because it's creating no overhead for other platforms, essentially, and it performed extremely well. And then we rotated the device on landscape, which we didn't even design for it, and it responded how it was meant to be. And we're like, whoa, it actually looks pretty good. So this overall experience was, they're doing something different. They're not there yet, especially because at the time they didn't even have web views. But we could see that the foundation of what was being set up was going to be great for our use case.
Yeah, that's a fantastic intro, because I think you and I are kind of similar thinking. It's like, okay, what cross-platform Flutter? Yeah, okay, sounds good, but must be some kind of downside. There's always something. We've probably all played with Ionic. We've played with React Native. We know what that means. Yeah. And then when you start getting surprises like this, it's like, okay, this is interesting. This is kind of working. This is nice. It's interesting you talk about the list, because I hear that a lot when people talk about like comparing native Android development with Flutter. It's like, okay, when you make a list, you have to like reuse these components and pump things up, or I forgot what the terminology is for like lists in Android, but I remember it's quite complicated. There's a lot of things you have to do to make it flow really nice. But like you said, with Flutter, it's just like you just do it and it just works.
Yeah, it's free. And I remember that even nowadays, I think there's some critiques about React Native list. And again, I think I got to a point that probably is good enough for a lot of these use cases. But when we start implementing, it's almost like you're changing the requirements of the application because you want a list to perform, right? You don't want to have a lot of dynamic elements and so on. And you can get there, but you have to put a lot of work, right? When Flutter, you're just saying, okay, I'm going to create this row, this item, and I'm just going to throw in the list, and it does a good job rendering.
Yeah, that's true. But that's also kind of a negative thing sometimes when you think about it too. Like, my personal opinion is like when something is easy to onboard, you're going to have a lot of people who don't know exactly what they're doing that will kind of come in, do some stuff for people, and then you get kind of a little bit of a disaster, right? Like you look at like PHP, a lot of exploits can happen, a lot of things can happen but it's also so easy to get started. But because it's so easy to get started and get going with it, that's where you kind of can hurt yourself if you're not very careful. Same with React. Like React is also kind of simple, but also difficult. But at the same time, once you get into it, it's flexible that you can do a lot of things. But then so to give you some background, like when I worked in a bank, the first project I was working on, we rendered a table, 200 rows in a table. It took 30 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So I had to go through and kind of fix all that mess. And it was all on the front end because I debugged where it was coming from. So if you're not careful, you can really hurt yourself.
Yeah, I think Dart helps minimize that a little bit, right? The fact that you have a typed language, the fact that, the whole build context conversation about what is build context, why they have to be in the build context. These things, I think they help their layout itself, right? You have to render in specific ways. It's very flexible in some ways, but I think it's almost like they have these guidelines that you follow, which minimize that. Yeah, if Dart was it was not typed, for example, like JavaScript, and you could, define context items outside of the widget build method. I think, I definitely think things will get messier. much quicker, and then performance will definitely be a concern.
Yeah, that's true. I think maybe you talked a lot about FVM with a lot of people. So if you guys don't know, he worked on FVM, which is Flutter Version Manager. Allows you to flip what version of Flutter you want. I think you probably went through the story about why you did that on other podcasts and other places. So we probably don't need to walk through that. But there's something else that's been attracting you recently, right? That you're working on. And I think you're pretty excited about it, which is Mix, right? So we brought you on here to talk all about Mix. And so, yeah, like what is Mix? Because it's kind of like, it's open, it's out in the open, but at the same time, it's not, I mean, you got some docs on it, but it's just not clear exactly what it is, at least when I read it. And I think you already know that, hey, this is maybe not the clearest. So maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about what is Mix? What's it here to solve? Why should I care about it?
I think it's a good exercise to start talking and define about it, because I'm extremely excited about Mix. I think the problems that we aim on solving, they're being solved, and it's been a great tool, but it is a lot of exploration, and I'm actually started implementing better docs with examples and things like that. So I think between now and January, we're going to be able to tell that story a lot better, right? So I'll start with Mix. Mix is a tool that allows us to, the tagline is to be able to build, beautiful design systems in Flutter effortlessly, right? So essentially it's to making it much easier to build, Flutter design systems or design widgets and components and so on. So one thing, and again, based on my experience when we were building Flutter apps, we've seen that, Flutter can be verbose in some ways, which I think I'm okay with being verbose. And again, I think some people that come from the web, they might have another opinion. But, for the most part, I'm okay being verbose. Flutter, they take the opinion of being things to be widgets being composable instead of being inherited, right? Which is also another great decision. So for example, if you have a text and if you want to add a padding to a text, you're not going to inherit the text and add a padding. You're going to wrap with that padding widget, right? So there's a lot of power that comes when adding some of these things. The challenge when it comes to visual attributes and visual primitives is defining a text that has padding and a text that, for example, would not have padding, and then you want to have a text that does have padding and is blue and so on. Now you start missing the separation of the visual definition against the widget or behavior, right? So they go together. Everything in the widget essentially is behavior and styling. They go hand in hand. And I think the Flutter team is aware in that in some cases, right? That's why we have a widget called container, right? So if you open up the code for container is a widget that essentially wrapping, building, making it easier, developer friendly, a lot of these different widgets, right? The constraint box and, color box in some cases, right? And size and so on. So it's creating an API to make these things much easier. And container is probably the most, I'm willing to bet, it's probably the most used widget there. So there's definitely a benefit of having that level of flexibility. And you also see this on the theme side. So for example, when you define a text style on your material theme, when you're building an app, you're going to be doing a lot of this copy with, right? Hey, I want the headline 1, copy with color blue, right? Because I want the same thing, color blue. So there is some inheritance. The challenge is the theme side, it doesn't apply for all the visual properties. So coming back to the initial challenge, when working on Flutter apps, and there's also a project called Sidekick, right? Which is the GUI for the Flutter version management FVM. And, building it and doing the styling. And initially when we build the app, we added the material widgets, we had the material theme, and the app, it looked good, but it looked like every other app, right? So it looked like every other app. It looked like material. So I was saying, okay, let's make this a little bit unique, right? So we start customizing a little bit, right? So for example, hey, I want a button. They have the align button and button, but actually I want a different type of button. I want buttons with icons to look in a different way, or I want different color variations of buttons that is not just primary, secondary, right? And I want boxes to look in a different way. And one thing I found out is that maintaining what I was creating, this design system, was extremely difficult to keep consistent, right? It was becoming extremely difficult to be consistent because for everything, I essentially had to create a widget to change one small thing of it, right? And the challenge is not even building it, right? So people can say, okay, so it takes a little bit longer to build. That's no problem, which I also agree. But design systems change. And keeping design systems consistent is, I'll say, is the main pain point, right? So you're saying, hey, I like this, but I would like to have more spacing around things. For you to go through every button and sometimes button variation, right? You have a button that is, I don't know, padding 4, and then you have a button that's padding 8. And you say like, actually, no, I want to be padding 2. So now this one has padding 2. Now this one has to be padding 4. You have to kind of go through the whole process of readjusting the layout, and you go through this process where there's a lot of inconsistencies and so on, right? And if you go to other places, even material itself, you see that the use of design systems is very common, right? So you have a lot of design systems where they say, okay, here are my design tokens, right? Certain colors, certain textiles. Here's my spacing that I use throughout, right? And I can say large is padding, padding large, it will be padding with 8, padding small will be a padding with 4. And you start to essentially have a place to configure these things, right? And another thing is, if you have a button and you want to change one small thing, you should be able to easily do that without creating a lot of overhead or creating a new component or new widget just to do that. So one of the ways to think of mix, and I don't know if this is the best analogy when it comes to where Flutter is right now, but mix, it's a lot like CSS is for HTML. So before in HTML, you used to define all these properties on these elements, right? And then you had CSS, which you create these style sheets, and the style sheets, they actually, you could inherit from each other, right? And you could put them in classes and reuse these classes throughout the process. And there's, of course, this made things much easier to organize, to extend, to build. And that's what Mix aims on doing, is essentially separating the visual description and the visual, let's say, creating these visual primitives where it's, here's the styling, you can play, you can inherit, you can do things like that, and then you can use within your widget.
Yeah, I was looking at the README on pub.dev. So this is the same one, right? If you pub.dev/packages mix, this is the same one, I'm guessing, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it looks pretty interesting. Like I really like this idea of the what is this one called? I just lost it. The mix chooser, mix.chooser. I like this one. We have a condition, a true and a false. I think that's super useful because you could be doing some very interesting things where things are true and false. And the only way to make it nice is you have to make a separate widget to do this. But yeah, this is pretty cool.
If I can show I have a little demo if you want to go through and then we can discuss, unless you have something else.
No. Please go ahead. And when you're talking about it, definitely talk as much as you can because people may not be watching the video.
Okay. So for people thinking about mix and what is mix, I'll give a simple example here. All right. So I'm showing an example of a basic example of mix. And it's pretty much showing a purple box. Okay. So here I defined a mix. And I'm actually saying, hey, the height is 100, the width is 100, is rounded, right? And I say rounded 10, which how much is rounded? I give it an elevation, and I can say the background color is purple. I want the line center, and the text color I want to be white. Okay. So then I have a box which I call the text mix. The text mix is the equivalent of the text widget. Now, first thing that you see is I can define a specific mix to text, but the text mix is actually inheriting the text properties from this. So the text color and the background color and the alignment is all being inherited. So within 6 or 7 lines of code, I described, and also in plain English. People can build their own, and I wonder if eventually if it's popular enough, people can build their own, let's say, definitions. But it's in plain English. You're describing what something is to look like and allows to inherit it. So I have a box. I describe the box and I add it there, and I say, hey, I want the text to look a specific case. Okay, so it's very plain and simple. Another benefit of mix is mix can be defined outside of the context. Now, the Flutter team suggests when you're using using gap methods essentially or something like this, just so hot reload works. But you can define mixes anywhere. So for example, you can have mixes that are defined globally, and now when they get rendered, when they get executed within the box, when it's time to be built within the context, any context information that needs to be brought in will be brought in. Okay, so another benefit of mix is mix can be defined anywhere and be shared anywhere, right? So essentially is description that is being used. Another benefit of mix, and now let me know if you have any questions also.
So wait, because you're saying that, I'm just trying to understand what you talk about the build context. So somehow it's able to pull in the build context, although you defined it outside of the build method, right?
Yes, because essentially what I'm doing is when mix defines these things, is creating these attributes, and at some point these attributes will be converted into the properties that they represent, and at that time they will get build context information. I think a better example here will be something for the design token piece. Okay, so if I go here, and here in this example, I'll put mix here. Okay, so the concept of design tokens, right? So of course, if I want to define a color, I can always do a const, and I can say main color, and I can say, I want this to be colors blue, right? Color blue. So this is a const, I can reuse this. However, as we know, things have to be within the build context. So if you think of a const as a design token, mix allows us to have what I'll call context design tokens. So for example, here we build, mix already has some tokens which represent the color scheme and some of the text styles, right? So for example, if I say background color is, and here for people listening, I'm saying background color is spawn surface, right? So this converts into a color ref here, if you see the type, right? So it's a color reference. So essentially saying this is not a color now. This is a reference of a color at build time, right? But I'm defining separately, and it allows me to pull in all. I think one of the initial conversations that we had is saying, why do I need mix when I can use material? And mix is not a replacement material at all, right? Mix is meant to be used with material. So in this example, I have background color surface, line, and for example, the text color I have on surface. Okay, and because the theme changes on surface, if I go to dark mode, you can see that the context design tokens also will change based on the context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's making sense. So this $ surface, this is something that looks like it's defined from within Mix itself, or is this something somewhere else? Yeah, okay. So, but how does this, can we make our own color refs ourselves?
Absolutely. So if you go here, what is the, and very simply, and I think it's extremely extensible, but this token is just saying a color ref is primary. I'm defining here very simply, if you will. Okay. And then on the mix theme, I'll go here. Sorry, let me go to defaults. There you go. So here are the, let's say, default tokens, and you can override them and you can create more. But essentially what I'm doing here, and I'm showing the mix theme. Okay. What the mix theme shows is I'm defining the color ref, which I define here. So here is also color ref, and I'm saying how the color ref should be built. So I say, here's a token. I go ahead and reuse the same tokens defined. And within the theme, I say, this token should be converted into this. Now, what makes this interesting is because the reference to color is a color itself. That means that wherever I use colors, I can pass a color reference, right? But essentially, this is how you define it. So you could easily go here and say, any specific context value, and you can just say, we're going to pass the build context and what value you want to return. And same thing for here, for the body, text, and the text styles. We have the text style references, right? So you can see here that it's very easy for you to start building your own context-aware design tokens, if you will.
So where's the flipping of the definition of the color ref? That's happening in your theme somewhere else. Sorry, when I was looking at this, I think the video went out on your screen, so I may have missed some detail. So I understand that it's pulling from the build context, but it seems like the color ref doesn't get decoded until it's into the widget tree where it has a build context, right? But the color ref, I'm just trying to see, where would you flip that? Where is it actually getting flipped for between the two different, dark mode and light mode?
No, so this is the theme data itself, right? So when I go to dark mode, it's actually switching the context data. So it's the same thing with the theme, right? So when I'm in dark mode and I get primary, it's going to get the dark version of the theme, right? The color scheme of the dark version of the theme. So this color scheme here that I'm calling is essentially the theme of context dot color scheme, right? It's just an extension. So when the context changes, it's just getting out the dark theme itself. So that's why it's doing that switch. I'm not doing anything. All I'm doing is saying I'm just referencing the color from the material theme itself, right? And this is, pretty much the result. So very simply, I can go ahead and I can define outside of it and use it within. Now, one thing also that I mentioned that is important is talk about what is it doing behind the scenes? What is a box and what is the magic? So a box essentially is just a container, right? So if I go to the code base of the box here, the box, we have things like the mix, the context notify and so on. But if you go into the box, all I'm doing is this. If it's animated, it's an animated container. If it's a container, it's a container. So when I mentioned that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel in certain ways and leverage everything that Flutter offers, is box is a helper that you're going to be interacting with, right? It's like text, right? The text mix is essentially the same as it's just wrapping a text widget and passing the text properties within, right? So that keeps the footprint very small throughout.
Yeah, okay. I see it now. So you're leveraging the current material widgets in order to extend and give it this kind of way to extend even more. Okay. It's interesting.
And I'll give an example here of the pressable. So there's another component, I'll say another primitive called pressable. Okay. And pressable is, the equivalent of a button or of anything that you want to show gestures on it, right? So if I go here, I have a mix defined for pressable, and I go ahead and define it, right? It's rounded. And I'll just hide this for now. But I have it rounded. I give it a padding and elevation. I say the background color is primary. The text color is going to be on primary, right? And I want it to be bold text, right? So we have some utility functions, right? But this is also can be representing to font, weight, right? Font weight bold, right? However, you have the ability to create some utility functions to do things like that. And I have this button, I have elevation, everything looks good. And I want to, when I hover, I want to change the text color and the background color, right? So I can go ahead here, and you can see that now when I'm hovering, things are changing. And also keep in mind that this can be defined outside of the build context, right? So essentially is I defined the properties that I want to be on hover, right? And I want the properties that I want to be on press. So if I go here on scale, I press the button, you can see here that I'm changing, when I press, I'm changing my elevation, okay? And I'm changing my scale. And the good thing is if I want to animate it, and I determine my starting point animation, I just add animated property to mix, and now everything animates in between the elevation, the colors, the animate in between. Everything works seamlessly within that context itself.
How about, is there extra properties for your animated so you can do more fine-toned animations, like how long the animation takes?
So yeah, here on the animated, you can pass a duration, which to keep things simple, I pass in milliseconds, right? So you can see here effect, and I can also pass a curve. So there are some properties also that to pass and make these things a little bit better and cleaner. So it does give you some control on that.
Yeah, this is pretty cool. It definitely takes a little bit of, it's a little bit jarring when you first see it, but I can start to see how this can make things very interesting when you start defining things.
And I'll give you one example, and I'll do the best to describe also. There's things for design tokens and design systems like spacing, right? You want the same spacing, like the example I gave for padding, right? So for padding, for example, we can do padding small, for example, right? We can do padding large. So now I don't have to define the size of the padding. This could be defined on the mix theme, and I can just reuse throughout, right? So every time I use the padding, I don't have to say, oh, I want this padding small, I want this padding large. Now, another interesting thing that I can do, and this is one of the powers of mix overall, is that if I want the padding overall to be 20, but I can go ahead and say that padding bottom, I want to be 10. So I'm essentially just saying all the padding will be 20, but padding bottom will be 10. So I can always override the properties, right? I can say on hover, I want the button to change. So for example, here is a great example. I have scale 1, but when I press, I have scale 0.9, right? And this is called the variance. So on press, this variance is being, the scale 1 is being overridden, right? And this way you have the behavior. So there's a lot of merging and overriding of properties that can be done. And one thing that I'll mention, and one of the ways to think of mixes is a tool to build design systems. So on design systems, and you see that on Flutter also, you have variations of certain things, right? So you have like a button, and then you have an outline button, and so on and so forth. So one thing that Flutter allows us to do, mix, is to declare variants. Okay, so here I'm defining an outline variant. Very simple. I have a variance class and I'm passing outline. And now what I can do is within mix, I can say outline. Okay, and I can say that, let me just remove the elevation piece real quick. And I'm going to say that what I want is the outline. I want the border color to be blue, right? The blue, the primary color that I have there, right? And I also want the text color to be blue and the background to be transparent. Okay? So what does this mean? It means that there's a variance of this mix called outline that inherits all the pieces here, but will override certain. The reason this is important is because this essentially becomes a namespace. So if I want a button that I want to be an outline, we're able to pass the variance of the button. So if I want to have many different types of buttons that essentially have the same scale, have the same animation, have the same curves, have the same fonts, everything, but I want to override certain things, all I have to do is create a variance. And I can go ahead and pass a variance through, and also there's some helper methods to pull the variance. But this is one thing that we've seen that is extremely powerful. So for example, if you want to create a typeset, you can create a mix with the declaring your fonts and just declare, headlines as variants and use throughout.
Yeah, this is quite cool. The only thing is I always find that as I build an app bigger and bigger and bigger, you're going to find that you're going to have a ton of different variants because every single page will be different. I don't know, that's just been my kind of experience, but I do like that you can make an outline like this. I think this is pretty cool.
And one of the ways to do this is, again, we try to keep the context of the design system. Now, you can style everything, right? You can kind of go through and every element do itself, right? But when you normally go through a design system, you're going to declare your typesets. You're going to declare, let's say, your colors. You're going to define, all these are design tokens, right? You're going to go define your spacing. And then you go into an element like button, and you're going to say, okay, here's the color of my button. Here's the token of the text. Here's the token of the spacing, right? And now you're saying, I want variations of this button, right? So essentially, this minimizes a lot of the behavior. And one of the things that I'm playing with idea is have some of what I call like these headless components, if you will, right? So these foundations that already accept some of these things, right? So for example, here, I'll give an example. We have some elements that were created with Mix, okay? And I'll go here. I would like to show just how powerful Mix can be. So here's a problem that I, for example, had, right? So I created an active variant. Okay, I have an active variant for this checkbox, okay? So I have the box, and I'm pretty much saying, okay, it's rounded, here's the color, here's the border gray, the width, okay. And what I do is, when it's active, I want the color to be the primary, and also the icon color to be primary, and also the border color to be primary, right? And you can see here I have animated on, and it has a nice color transition here, okay? Now for behavior's sake, this is nice, but I want feedback when I hover, right? And this is what I had before. So I want this blue border when I hover also to be blue, even though it's not active, okay? So this is important for me from a behavior perspective. So one thing that we do here, we have this, leveraging bitwise operators. So essentially I pass hover, and I have a bitwise operator like a pipe. So I have over or active. And what I do now, actually, and what we can see here that now I have this nice polished experience, right? I'm saying that, hey, I want this to apply for 2 variants, right? And the same, another operator that I have, for example, if I want it, they say I only want to be hover and active. I can also define that. I want this variant to apply for hover or variant or active. So this is extremely powerful. So this is, we're creating these small elements. And I think this is one of the benefits that we're seeing is the ability to define, first of all, define in plain English and be able to, have that level of control, not being too verbose, if you will, and being able to, override and also creating variations, right? And that's why I think, mix is similar to what CSS is for HTML, right? On how the definitions came along, but on the Dart way. So having things like the build context and so on, it makes extremely powerful. And I'll give one example. The hover behavior and the Dart behavior, these are variants. So when I define a variance also, here, it actually allows me to pass a check function. So for example, if I want this color to activate this, to always be active, actually, let me show you I think it's better to show the implementation of hover, for example. So here's the whole variant implementation of hover, okay? So on hover, I'm defining a variant, and I pass the value here as a namespace. So essentially just hover as text, and I have a check function, right? So the check function is context, and I check the pressable notifier, and I flip this. I check if this is true or not. What does this mean? That essentially is when I create a variant, I can actually give a callback context function that will make it automatically be applied, right? So I can go ahead and apply active or not, or I can say that, hey, I don't even want to apply active or when apply active. Just listen to the context. Listen to this context. Whenever this provider changes value, apply these stylings, right? And that's why we've seen that is extremely powerful from that perspective.
Yeah, this is pretty cool. But is this actually ready for production use right now, or is this still kind of an experimentation phase?
So it's experimentation. So I won't say it's ready for production, especially because, design systems want to keep consistent, so the APIs change. However, we're very close, right? We are creating, let's say, best practices and opinions. And to be honest, the main APIs have not changed much. So, but I just disclose, prototypes and things like that being adjusted. Everything is, we plan on being very easy and implemented with Flutter. So for example, things like the box doesn't change because at the end there's a container, and anyone can create any type of utilities or attributes, right? So I think even going forward, that backwards compatibility and transition, is very easy. But it's still an experimentation phase. But I think by the end of the year, if you will, or January, we will what I think will be a 1.0 release. But it's extremely exciting, and I'll show one more case, which is if developers want to extend this, right? I'll give an example. The container does not have an opacity value, right? So you are able to also create what we called decorator attributes. So what decorator attributes are is you can create an attribute that you can go in and say that opacity, this is an example of a decorator attribute, and you can say that opacity is a certain value. And what this does is it doesn't modify the box. It uses the composable nature of Flutter. And essentially, you can define that when you call opacity, it means that you're going to create an opacity widget. So if I go into the implementation of this, okay, here's a opacity widget attributes, right? Which in the documentation now we call them decorators. So you can see here that essentially I pass the mix context in the child, and I pass an opacity widget or animated widget. So the reason this is one of the ways we like to maybe approach the community in some cases. People are building these awesome widgets and extremely powerful widgets, right? And Mix wants to be lightweight and not very opinionated. So to be able to annotate widgets as value and say, hey, if you're using Mix and you want to use our widget or this other party widget that you don't have, you can create the widget decorators, right? And easily use within Mix without, it's a way to extend Mix without Mix becoming, let's say, too bloated, right? So Mix only has a few primitives. It has a box, it has a flex box, which is the equivalent to, row, column, and the flex widget. It has text, icon, and that's pretty much it, right? So icon translates into an icon, text into a text, a box into a container, a flex box into a flex element. There's some other ones that we might be building, like image and so on. But as an example, the goal is to be extremely lightweight and be extensible. So I know there's a lot to digest.
Yeah. That's where I'm at right now. Is I'm just still digesting all this stuff because it's really it's jarring, but not in a bad way. It's just okay, I got to soak all this in. I'm just thinking about some cases, right? One thing I just noticed is that you have animated, right? Mm-hmm. So let's say you want to have animated hover, but not animated press. Is that actually possible?
Yes. One of the current things that we have with you say you want to animated hover, but not press.
Yeah, because what I see is you often, I was looking at your animated, inside the container, right, or the box you is animated, and you have a different type of widget coming out. Opacity also is, if it's animated and you have an animated opacity, which makes sense. But let's say there's some things you want animated, some things you don't for whatever reason. Do you have a way to selectively apply animations to certain things and be very specific about certain animations?
Yeah, so that is I think a great point, and something that it is in the roadmap with this thought about going forward. There, so for example, you want to only animate, let's say the color or the size, but you don't want to animate something else. Right now, to make the API simply, we pass the animated value throughout. But that's something that we discussed, and we're just trying to see how much complexity we would add to be able to implement this. So essentially just doing a value to animate or not. Now, you can do similar things by having separate mixes, right? That's one of the ways you can do, because essentially you're saying that this mix is animated, but there's a situation that you don't want the mix to animate, and implement a little bit of that chooser, which is not ideal right now. But yeah, I think that's a good point if you want to just define some animated properties. That's not something you can do right now, but it's something we've discussed.
The other thing I'm thinking about too is when you showed me padding, and you could override with bottom padding, if you could do animated and somehow override no animated, or you know what I'm saying, something like that. I'm just thinking I just picked out one property, but I'm just thinking about how you can selectively, and remove things.
Yeah. So for example, if I do animated here, I'll try to describe for people that are in the audio, and I can actually go animated and pass false. Maybe I can be looking, but I can actually override it and say it's not animated here. So I can override from that perspective. So I can say, hey, within this, I want this to be animated and animated, but it's being applied to the whole mix, if you will. Now, one of the ways you can do this is maybe you have you can have also a variant that's animated, right? And a variant that is not animated. That's another example. So these are some of the things that we're still creating best practices around. And however, when we went in to create design systems now, and this is our experience, it's such a pleasant way of building components. and building, again, not building these functional widgets, but building visual primitives, right? So when you're building visual primitives, right, I want to go through and say, what would a Flutter app look for me right now? It wouldn't look like mix everywhere. What I'll do is I'll have certain visual primitives that are built using mix and then being used throughout the app, right? With Cupertino widgets, material widgets, and so on, right? So you have just these primitives that we're going to be using to build that functionality.
Okay, yeah, I see. So this is just a tool to kind of augment the visual aspects, not like totally replace everything with mix.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you build tools for specific use cases, right? And mix is being optimized to build visual primitives, right? So that's what we want to do is build, again, design systems, right? It allows, already provides some visual primitives and so on, but it's to build mostly design systems. So I'll say, if you're familiar with atomic design, right? Or the components where you have, atoms, molecules, and so on. We want those initial primitives to be like the atoms side to be, and maybe some molecules, but not essentially have all these, every property you have in the scaffold, or you have a list view, we start throwing mix in. You can, but that's not what is meant to do. It's meant to define the design language of the app and be shared throughout the application.
Yeah, I can see this as a interesting way to do like the theming and all that. It's like an augmentation to that, I would say, or another way to do it. We can start defining certain things. Okay, I mean, I think I would have to play with this some more to get real good idea about how and when I'd want to use something like this. But I do like the ideas. I think it's pretty cool. Yeah, has there been any feedback from anybody else besides people in your team, like any outsiders?
Yeah, we're using mostly internally, and that's the thing. Once you go into the README file, we're very clear that is being used internally, but it's the experimental stage. But we don't have a lot of feedback. But we're trying to solve a specific problem. And I'll say, even though Mix is not out, I think this is the second or third, let's say, iteration on how we approach things. Right, so it has gone through already a major refactor because of that, to make things simpler and so on implemented. Now, building a design system internally and maintaining it, right? Because one of the benefits that also we have now is whenever we have, let's say, a Figma file, right, or sketch file or so on, that defines a design system and defines the spacing, defines the color, it defines the types of shadows, right? We're going in and we're creating a mix, and we're saying, okay, here's the colors, the color references, here's the spacing throughout, and we're defining all the spacing that is being used throughout, right? So there's this very easy transition from the visual design into Flutter for some of these primitives. And that's one thing, it's about telling the story, right? We still have to do a better job of explaining, being clear what's the benefit. There's a couple people from the community that we shared, and similar thing, becoming familiar and seeing and getting feedback of, hey, I would like to be able to do this, or how would I be able to do that? And we, some things make sense and we're adding it. But I won't say not things that are like closer to production use, external to the company.
Okay. Beyond that, it's pretty cool. Like I said, I think maybe I need to play with this some more to see how I feel. Is there a pretty late version already up on pub.dev, or would we have to get something from GitHub directly if you want to start playing with this by ourselves?
Yeah, so pub, we're working on documentation. I think the end of the week, the guys will have what I think is more approachable documentation that actually goes through about the APIs and all the utilities they're creating, and goes into about how are things working behind the scenes, right? Because that's one thing. When people see something like this, they're like, okay, this doesn't look like the theme on Flutter, right? And there people get concerned, which is a valid concern about like, oh, there's so much magic happening. And even though I think the magic of Mix, if you say there's a magic, is on the API. It's not on the inner workings. The inner workings it's Flutter, right? It's simple. It's very basic widgets, right? But there's a lot of work that was put throughout getting the API and interacting the API in this specific way, right? So that's something that we want to work. So we work on the documentation. I believe the version of pub.dev is the last one is 0.03. It's still early on. I think people can play. We want to create some recipes, if you will. We're playing an idea of creating headless components. So essentially, is if you want to build your own design system, you don't want to build it from scratch. We're going to provide. The goal is for us to have like say switches and a checkbox and some basic buttons, and so have these which we're still playing if it's going to be within Mix or not, but essentially have these other primitives that go in and say, if you want to build your own design system, here's some things that everyone needs, so you can go ahead and use it, and you can overwrite them with Mix, right? So it kind of gives you a starting points for creating these design systems.
Okay, that's pretty cool. I don't think I have any other questions. I think it's just I need to play with it, but I do like it. It seems pretty straightforward. It's, like I said, jarring when you first see it because it's totally different than what we're used to. But I can see this being a way to, like you said, create those visual components.
Yeah, and that's something I just coming back to the tools, how I got to Flutter and everything. Going to Flutter is extremely powerful technology. And we want to be more efficient, be more productive, and build more things in Flutter. So all the work and the tools that we're trying to build with Flutter, they're aimed on solving specific problems that we have internally for products that we have internally. So the main goal of Mix, as I mentioned, is to make the building design systems much easier. And one thing that we're doing within the company exploring is building design systems. But not just one design system, right? Because one design system, you can do it. But we want to not only build lots of design systems, different design systems for different cases, but also allow these design systems to be customizable, to be overridden, right? For people to make their own. And that's where we come in and say, okay, let's approach this from a ground up and see what is the current design system approach? How are people interacting with design systems? And that's why we have these things like spacing, color, text, right? These design tokens approach. And that's why we're coming in and trying to bring that specific language and those design language from all the design systems into Flutter.
Yeah, this is very cool. Is there anything else you wanted to kind of mention about Mix before we start the wrap up?
No, I think it's just something that we're excited about. I think there's a lot of interesting solutions for even some other, let's say, approaches that we've seen when it comes to styling and themes. And I'll say that it is a problem that we're passionate about solving, and that's why we working on Mix, right? So I think time will tell. I think within a month or so, we might have something that is more stable and do a better job explaining and giving a starting point, because it's a little bit different. And one of the feedbacks that I have from people that I've shown, not used, is it opens up Flutter for communities like we started talking about, the web community, right? So Flutter is similar to TypeScript and JavaScript and so on. But when it comes to styling, interacting, and some of these things, it is very different, right? So some of the people that had like a web background, like, oh, I get it, I understand it, right? And I can actually translate the web companies that are making the transition from web and considering a Flutter app, right? I think they might be more open if they say they can also easily bring their design systems and design language into other technologies. So we're trying to make this a little bit easier. So it's just those starting points, but I think that there's some maturity that will take place and so on.
Yeah, definitely. I love how this mix seems like a class that you can reapply and it kind of follows the CSS rules. That's what I like about it a lot. And I can see how this one makes it easier for people to onboard to style things up because you can make a link and then you can make a link look like a button, right, with CSS. And I could see you being able to do the same thing with Mix.
Yeah, one of the things, I guess will be the last thing here. So you on Mix, and I didn't mention this, but on Mix, it's very easy for you to, let's say, define, right? So I'm defining here this particular mix here. And an example, I can define this whole mix here, okay? And I can actually apply within another mix, right? So talking about combining mixes, I can have, these mixes that is saying, hey, it's rounded or whatever certain color, and I can go in and just apply to it. And it just makes things extensible. And most important, I think you brought up a good point, is like people getting ahead around it. We have to create the best practices. And we're still defining some of these things and finding out some of these things, right? But we are prioritizing API and developer experience on this. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say about Mix.
Yeah, it's not a lot, but at the same time, there's also a lot to say because it's very interesting. Yeah, for you guys who can't see it, definitely check it out when it comes out. I think by the time this episode comes out, I think you should have the documentation updated because I think it's about 2 to 3 weeks this episode should come out. So hopefully that should give you enough time.
Oh, very cool.
But in any case, yeah, check it out. I think this is pretty cool. I may bring this to my client tomorrow or the next day because I think it's interesting. Maybe after the docs come out, so it's easier for them to take a look at it. But yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so maybe let's start to wrap up because we went quite a bit over time, which is okay.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, don't worry about it. It's okay. Yeah, I think there's 2 big questions I like to ask that are pretty good, which is, what kind of state management solution do you usually reach for when you're going to be using state management within Flutter?
So I'm a Flutter hooks / river pod person. So again, a lot of the React and React Native. That's what drove me to Flutter hooks, and everything I do use Flutter hooks. I think it's a great solution, and that's why state management there's some projects that on ThinkHero we use initially a block and provider and so on, but when I get a choice, I think Riverpod is the implementation we go with.
And then the last question is, do you have any tips for beginners or any kind of warnings for people to say, hey, watch out for this or be careful of that for people who are starting to work out with Flutter?
There's a couple of things that I suggest. I think that actually I have a Twitter thread about some of these things, but the docs, and again, I know it's a little bit cliche to say read the docs, but you should read the docs when it comes to how layouts get rendered. Right? How constraints and how constraints get applied. You should read it and reread it. That's going to save you a lot of time. And another thing is Flutter team has a great YouTube channel that they talk about the widget of the week. Very short videos, but they're so powerful into explaining what each widget does. So you should definitely check out. If you have a question about widgets and you're trying to see how widgets can be used, go that route. That's also going to save a lot of effort.
Yeah, that's good advice, I think. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we sign off for the day?
No, again, thanks for having me. Thanks for having some awesome people from the community. And, I think it's a lot of value to have some of these talks and get some of this feedback. So yeah, I appreciate it.
No, I think it's good to get people who maybe not everybody knows these kind of people. Right? We had some people who, like you said, are kind of a little bit well known, but it's also good to have people who are not so well known who are doing interesting things.
Yeah.
Because those are people that really do some pretty inspiring stuff, right? Like, not everybody probably knows who you are, right? So, but you're working on some really cool stuff with Mix. So I'm excited to see this to come out. And I'm curious if this would actually have an effect on Flutter itself. Maybe they're going to start including this within Flutter, or maybe make some changes because of it. Who knows?
Yeah, that might be a more long term, but it's definitely interesting on the more use cases that Flutter will get applied to, right? I think these tools become more important.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for coming on. We may have you back on after a couple months to kind of talk about, what have your lessons learned from this? Could be never try this again, or it could be this has been really inspiring and we got something really out of this, or who knows? Like you said, nobody really knows, so you throw it out there and see how it goes.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.